This is Grumpy Oz Retro Episode 1, recorded on the 20th of June 2023. Some of the references made in this podcast may be out of date by the time you hear this. G'day and welcome to Grumpy Oz Retro Episode 1. My name's Tony and this podcast is about all things vintage computing and retro gaming from an Australian perspective. There was a great response to the pilot episode put out on my YouTube channel, so we've pushed that out to all the major podcasting platforms as Grumpy Oz Retro Episode 0. It contains the pod's origin story, so it might be worth a listen if you're into that kind of thing. Today we're bringing a very special guest along for the ride.
We knew the Australian table was going to be great. We knew we probably had too many Commodores, things like that. The British table actually ended up being really popular.
Yep, that's Jace, aka Mr. Lurch. He's had a very successful 2023 so far, having just hit 10,000 subs on the Mr. Lurch's Things YouTube channel, and Jace will be along later to talk about that, along with some other things. This pod is a team effort between myself and this man. G'day, Craig. How's it going?
Yeah, pretty good, mate. Yeah, getting along all right.
Oh, great to hear. What have you got going on at the moment?
Did pick up a fairly big Amiga hoard in the last week or so, which was pretty exciting. The thing I was pretty excited about was the Genlock that came with it. I always sort of wanted a Genlock as a lad, and now I've got one. Yeah, going to get that all set up, and some stage when I get my retro room, I come with a shit ton of discs, like I'm talking heaps, and it's quite funny actually. Been hit up by the National Film Archive to send them a couple of the old Darren Hinch and the Vizar demos and some really bad Neighbours bloody PD thing. So, pretty keen to get that off to them. Look, it's sat in the cupboard for 30 years. I've got it now, and I thought, look, I'm just going to sit it in the cupboard for 20 years myself. I might as well send it off to somebody who actually wants it. That was a pretty good pickup. Yourself, mate? You picked up much or got anything new?
Yeah, a couple of things. First thing was a ColecoVision that I didn't actually mean to buy.
Oh, I love those buys.
Yeah, I actually was expecting it to go a bit higher on eBay, so I put in what I thought was a fairly low ball bid, and I wasn't expecting anything to come of it. Lo and behold, I got it.
Nice.
It's working.
Do you think you'll get yourself a cart for it or something, like a bloody all-in-one?
Look, that's the plan. Quite amusing thing with this one is it came with the steering wheel attachment, which is awesome, but it didn't come with turbo. Last time I checked, the only game that ever used that particular expansion was Turbo. So, look, that's cool. I may grab a copy of Turbo in the meantime, but yeah, a multi-cart is absolutely on the radar. But it does have Donkey Kong Jr., which is one of the games I had. So, looking forward to playing with that. And buggered if I can remember the other game it came with, but I didn't have it when I was a lad. That's all I know about it.
Awesome, dude. I did have one other little pickup. Last year for Adelaide Retro, they have Septandy, and they also have Shit Timber. So a friend of mine who had a Tandy TRS-80 Model 1, she bought that across from Melbourne in the early 90s in the backseat of her car and got the shit melted out of it. Yeah, wow. So if you sort of see it, it's got this big gaping mouth above the keyboard where it got the hell melted out of it. So I combined Septandy and Shit Timber and took my Shit Tandy down to the group. Yeah, I took out a prize for it. And I tried to buy it off her when I gave it back to her because I just borrowed it. And she's like, oh, no, I want my nephew to, use that when he grows up and he can play on it and get him into retro and all that. And then get a phone. This is like, last year in September. I get a phone call last weekend. She's there like, oh, do you want that Tandy? I'm like, oh, what happened to your nephew? She goes, oh, I pulled it out and he didn't want to even know about it. Only 5 minutes and he went straight back to his phone. She goes, do you want the Tandy? I'm like, yeah, I want the Tandy. So I've inherited the shit Tandy, which is cool. I think the best thing that actually came with a bunch of games, and it also came with some catalogues. And I've just been cracking through those catalogues like no tomorrow. It just bringing back so many memories. So yeah, huge fan of the Tandy. So that's my little super pickup for this month.
Oh, that's fantastic. One more big retro thing that I acquired. Telecom computer phone.
That's awesome.
And I've got someone to thank for that. Someone who is actually our very first guest, Jace, aka Mr. Lurch. He was very kind. He sent this computer phone over to me as a donation for my YouTube channel. So the plan is to make some videos about it. It'll probably be
cool.
Oh, they just look so cool. And there's a longer term project with this one because I'm going to have to source parts from the UK and just scrounge around for whatever or wherever. It's a challenge, but I like a challenge. So I'm really looking forward to getting my teeth stuck into that one. We had a great response from the pilot episode, which we ended up putting out to the public, and it's made us think that we could, introducing a segment where people leave us feedback about what we're doing, and there may be a mailbag element, so we kind of came up with the idea of calling this segment the feedbag. It's time for Craig and I to dip our muzzles into the feedbag and see what we can pull out. So, Craig, you can have at it first, mate.
Yeah, no worries. Look, I got a bit of feedback from various places. A few comments come through to me via Messenger when we sort of launched the podcast out. Oh, yeah, that's pretty cool. Good job. Like the sort of content and the style. A couple of guys at Retro Night come up to us and said, oh, that's really cool. And then, of course, I hit them up straight away and said, would you like to be a bit of a guest on there and have a bit of a chat? So there were a few nods and a few weird looks. So that was pretty cool. But I think the best one I got was a guy at work. He's sort of into retro. Yeah. I said, oh, do you want to listen to my podcast? And he's like, oh, yeah, that'd be great. He goes, I spend 10 hours a week in the car. I'd love to listen to something like that. I said, oh, only goes for 40 minutes. But, yeah, I got a text that night. Oh, mate, that's great. It's bloody great effort. Really excited. That was really cool. When you're doing your next one? Yeah, it's great to get good feedback straight away. So, yeah, very exciting. Yourself, mate? What do you had anything out there?
The feedback I got via the Oz Retro Comp channel, I think a couple of smaller channels might have seen it and given me some feedback. Chris's Retro Nook said, great podcast, guys. Looking forward to more. And, yep. Thanks, Chris. Beauty. We'll certainly give you more. Aussie Retro Dude, nice one, guys. Thanks, Aussie Retro Dude. And Joseph Phillips is subscribing to the podcast and he appreciates it. Thank you, Joseph. A lot's been happening in retro news over the last few weeks, so we're not going to be able to cover absolutely everything. But here's a few stories that tickled us in particular. And Craig, there's one story that came and went very quickly, and it was just like a supernova.
Flash in the pan.
Poof, flash in the pan, yeah. It was the Amiga Global Alliance. Yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting, wasn't it? Sort of like we sort of put it on the bill and we said, oh, well, wait till we get to see what happens at the end of the Kickstart. And then all of a sudden, yeah, the whole thing got cancelled. So, look, from my point of view, I think straight up David Pleasance is an absolute legend, and if he had have actually bought Commodore as he tried, we'd probably maybe sitting here with a Commodore on our desk today. Maybe not.
Yeah.
Look, I think he had the right idea, but a lot of these things are already being delivered by the community. As a whole, you've already got some pretty good repositories for files and chat. And yeah, I just found it a bit of a weird model, to be honest. And I love his videos and I'm pretty keen to get his DVDs and his audiobooks and all that as well. But tying it into a Kickstarter, I found it just to be a little bit weird. And I couldn't actually really tell what was going to happen after the Kickstarter. Was that some sort of weird same funding arrangement, or I would have thought it would have been more of a Patreon sort of gig. So that was my sort of thought on the whole thing. The other thing is if you actually stop and take a look at something like the Pi Storm, so the Pi Storm 500, 600 and 1200 for the Amiga, like David was pushing for, this is a repository to get hardware up and running, and get it out to the community. Well, the Pi Storm community just did it. They didn't need anyone. They got all three of those items. I can go and buy any of them today from either eBay or various different groups. That's my 10 cents worth, mate. What's your thoughts?
I think it was an idea whose time had passed, and obviously the funding arrangement maybe not all that well thought out, particularly given that there have been a few controversial Kickstarters as of late, and the community is already kind of a bit on edge with Kickstarter. It was just really horribly timed. I get what David's trying to do. I tend to agree. I think David would have been an excellent custodian of the Amiga brand. But one big thing that I noticed, which I hadn't seen in a very long time, was just how united the Amiga community was, because it's been fragmented for so long, and whilst it's sort of resolved itself, it just seemed more galvanized than I'd seen it pretty much since the fall of Commodore. I mean, other than a few hardcore David Pleasance fanboys, and look, I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but then obviously he has done a lot, but I do know that some people think he can do no wrong and just couldn't see the reality of the situation. Other than a small handful of those guys, overwhelming majority of Amiga people were just like, what's going on? We really don't think it's necessary. And like I said, to get people from all different factions just in a unified voice, in some ways it was oddly heartwarming.
Well, yeah, I saw people that were on Facebook and they're like, they give it a complete hammering. And I'm there like, oh, these guys are going to get thrashed. And it got piles of likes and people started backing everyone up and going, well, we don't think this is the best idea for the community. And I was actually, as you say, I was quite impressed with the number of people that sort of got behind the no movement. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, this isn't going to happen. Then it just got pulled. So very interesting. What are you, Tony? What do you got kicking around of hot off the press?
Speaking of new stuff for old machines, Dave Curran from Timeth Software and Rod Hull from The Future Was 8-Bit have come up with a new version of the Penultimate cartridge for the VIC-20 called the Penultimate Plus 2. Same sort of deal as the previous two, but there are a bunch of improvements such as some revised menus, there are more test ROMs to test when your VIC-20's gone a bit bung, and more games than ever, including the entire Future Was 8-Bit VIC collection, which I think is running to about 15 games at the moment, so that's really cool. If having that many games is just blowing your mind and you don't know what to play, try Rod's Random ROM Runner, which will select a game for you at random. That's pretty cool. Even though it's not cheap, by the time it lands here in Australia, it'll be about $180, $190 dues. But for what you get, it actually is really good value for money, considering that if you were to buy the Future Was 8-Bit games all separately, you'd probably spend about that anyway. But to get all that functionality and to turn your VIC-20 into a little powerhouse, I think it's amazing. Details will be in the show notes, link to Dave's blog where he describes the Penultimate Plus 2, as well as a link over at the Future Was 8-Bit to go and buy. We're not affiliated or anything like that. We just think this is freaking awesome. And the wonderful thing with the Future Was 8-Bit and all their stuff and all their Timeth stuff is it's all done with their own resources, no crowdfunding. They just get on with it and they make some amazing stuff. If you've got a VIC-20 and you don't have a Penultimate cartridge, get on it. If you've already got one of the earlier Penultimate cartridges, I'm not sure if the upgrades may necessarily be worth your time. That's a decision you need to make after reading up about it. Craig, budding authors.
Yeah, so I sort of come across Vintage. I set up like Feedly on my phone the other day and put a whole bunch of retro channels in there, and the old Vintage is the new old popped up, and I've sort of just been referring back to the site, and I noticed they had a competition there for either writing an article about technical or non-technical retro stuff. Yeah, I saw that it runs out at the end of June, and they hadn't really had too many entries. So if you've got some sort of funky techo thing that you've done back in the 80s or some sort of story you think you need to get out there to the greater community, that's the place to do it. It's sort of 500 to 3,000 words, and there's a whole bunch of prizes and stuff that you could win. So we'll put a link in the show notes. It's a good little budding author thing.
Oh, it's fantastic, Craig. And there are so many of these great competitions in the retro community, not just for writers, but also for coders. The itch.io Adventure Game Jam 2023 just closed. Apogee co-founder George Broussard got involved, and he wrote a LucasArts-style point-and-click adventure game from scratch in 2 weeks called The Third Wish, and it looks really cool. If you're into that LucasArts style of point-and-click adventure, it looks like it's well worth checking out. It's available for free on the itch.io website, and there will be a link in the show notes. Like I said, it is free to download, but if you do want to throw a few dollars in George's direction, that's also a possibility.
Awesome. Yeah, Tony, what else is happening around the track? Something about a bloody Honda or something I heard.
Well, we all know about Will It Run Doom. That is a meme at this point. And I don't know if this is peak Will It Run Doom meme, but I don't know whether they're a lunatic or a genius, managed to port Doom to the head unit of a Hyundai. Now, this is a story that's from Hackaday. Some dude calling himself Green Luigi 1 decided to hack into his Hyundai's entertainment system and install Doom on it. The story doesn't actually say which model it is. It kind of looks like the latest model i30. Yeah, I'm not sure whether you really want to play Doom whilst driving. Don't Doom and drive, people. That's that could be very dangerous. But
let's go.
There's a YouTube video, and like I said, you got to see it to believe it. Again, show notes. You know what to do.
Yeah, I watched it and went, oh, geez, that looks hard work.
I'll tell you what, there's some really interesting stuff currently on eBay in Australia. I'll start with a machine that's currently under auction and will finish by the time we get this podcast out, and that's a Sega TerraDrive Model 3 circa 1991, Craig.
Awesome. I've seen the Amstrad ones. I didn't know that there was another model of that.
Outside of Japan, I don't believe it was sold, but no doubt someone will correct us if I've got that info wrong. This one is fully boxed, lightly used, tested to power up. Because it's Japanese, 110-volt power supply is required. The seller reckons they've inspected it, and it appears as though that the real-time clock battery is flat. but because it's a CR2032, there's not going to be any corrosion around it, so it looks like it's actually in really nice condition. Currently sitting at $520 dues with 2 bids. It finishes up in a couple of days, around lunchtime on Thursday. So what I'll do is I will drop in the final sale price here. $1,009. Whilst talking all things Sega, there is a Yeno SC3000H, which is effectively brand new in box, currently on eBay for $1,300 buy it now. Are you familiar with the Yeno at all, Craig?
No, but I am familiar with the SC3000 because I'd like to actually buy one. I've been trying to buy one from Japan. I missed out on a box one that went for $168 on Zen probably 2 months ago. I haven't really got back to it. They'll be sitting around $300 or $400. You can buy a sexy red one for $700 on Yahoo any day of the week. I don't know whether the French one's any better. What do you know about this one?
Well, I know that it's French and has the output, the CCAM output, which I believe means that it's a component output rather than the RF or the composite that we got here on the Australian domestic market. I'm surprised at how few SC3000 like locally delivered ones appear to be out there, because they were pretty big. I mean, back in the day, there were quite a lot of them out there. I mean, John Sands was the distributor here in Australia, and they were obviously the greeting card people and I guess a big reach into department stores and places like that. I remember seeing the SC3000 in places like Big W. So it was like there was plenty of them out there, and for whatever reason, they have all but disappeared, but they do come up on eBay occasionally. Mark from the Retro channel did a restoration on an SC3000 last year. I like the Sega SC3000 and the SG1000. The unorthodox architecture I find absolutely fascinating, but I don't know what I'd be able to do with it.
A couple of lads in the club have got them, and I've seen them at Retro Night before, so that's why I went, oh, geez, I want one of those. And I think the SVI CAS supports the Sega, so you can just pump out WAV files, or I don't think it's actually supported properly. If you know what the SVI CAS is, it's a touchscreen tape device that supports a huge range of 8-bit computers, and some of them actually support it natively, but I don't think the SC3000 is supported on that natively. But yeah, there's quite a few of them turned up at the club before.
Oh, yeah.
Commodore Land, what's going on there? I'm always excited about Commodores, Tony.
It's very unusual to see not one but 2 of the TED series machines on eBay at one time, particularly 2 that are in, well, one of them is effectively brand new in box, and the other one is a very rare bird here in Australia, and even in its native Europe, it's not common. We're talking the Plus 4 and the 116, or the 116, depending on how you want to say it. These are 2 buy it now machines. The Plus 4 is up for $800, and the 116 is in, well, that's kind of a quasi-auction situation, because the starting bid's $700, or you can buy it for $1,100, buy it now.
I'll make sure I don't take a look, because I don't need any more Commodore gear.
Okay, well, pretend we didn't just do the last few minutes of podcast then. But finally on eBay, we have an SGI. Now, SGI machines do turn up from time to time, and they're not cheap because they're still very highly coveted by collectors. This one is a Tesro, which is apparently a very rare piece of computing history. 3000.
It's vintage.
Well, yeah, it's vintage.
Are they all vintage?
They're all vintage.
It's another 25% to it, Tony. You know that?
Another 25% on 3,750 buy it now. For something that has no OS and is effectively being sold for parts or repair only.
And is as ugly as a hatful of arseholes as far as I'm concerned. That's a horrible looking thing. It looks like it could be used as a food processor or some sort of weird mould. Sorry, it looks like it should be a CubeSat. It should be launched into space. That's my opinion. Sorry, all you SGI. Hey, I have an SGI machine, so I'll reserve my judgment because I've got one. So there we go.
I do admire SGI's adventurous design language of the 90s, and a lot of that is subjective. To be honest, I think the Gene Ford lampshade is as ugly as sin, and the best place for those is landfill. Actually, no, not landfill. I tell a lie.
True.
E-waste, because we don't want to pollute landfill. And I'm going to get a lot of hate mail for that. But yeah, it's an uggo. The Cube's awesome. There are other iMacs of that era that are awesome, but the lampshade is just doing something stupid for the sake of doing something stupid. That said, I happen to like the Tesro and its slightly quirky looks.
Yeah, so ARC is the Adelaide Retro Computer Group. It's a like-minded group of individuals that get together once a month to get their retro kit out and get it on display. We generally meet the second Friday of the month at Unley Community Centre. So last month was the music/audio month for June. And look, I was really impressed with the turnout we had there. There was all sorts of paraphernalia around audio and equipment. I'll just run through some of the stuff that was there. The PC boys who normally sit up in the corner, I saw a couple of Audigy 2s there set up. They're generally just playing games. But next to that, we had Danny. Danny has a TRS-80 Colour Computer 1, and I think she's done a few mods to it. She had that coming into a DAC, which went then into a mixer and then into a fairly sexy Yamaha synthesizer. Now, a few people were goo-gooing and gaga-going over that synthesizer. Moving on, we had the Roland brothers, as I like to call them. Luke has a set of MA8 Roland speakers, and he had that plumbed into his Amiga 1200, and he had a Roland SC88 Pro. Next to him, we had Rowan. Rowan had a Commodore 64 with a MIDI interface running into a mixer, and then he had a couple of cool-looking, plain label, sexy old bloody white speakers, and I think they were reference speakers. I didn't get to actually hear them cranking, so I just assumed that they were pretty good. Mike had a Tari 520 ST. He had that plumbed into a Casio synthesizer, and he was sending MIDI files back and forth. Greg, he had a genuine IBM PS2, I reckon it was, and he had a DOS MP3 player called MX Play, I think it was called. Back over the other side, Ian, he is one of the guys that rolls up, and he generally brings a C64. Now, he had that plumbed into a Commodore Stereo, Tony. Now, I know you're a fan of the Commodore Stereo that you gave away back in the 90s. It must tug a few heartstrings there for you, mate. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, that's all good. But yeah, that definitely a piece of my youth right there. Sorry, go on.
Oh, look, I think we'll probably find you another one at some stage. Yeah, but the cool thing is Ian had that plumbed into his 64, and there's a demo that's come out, and I'll pop it in the show notes. It's by the producers. It just won X 2023 competition. It's a 4-disc jobby, and look, it's like watching an old school film clip. It is so well done. So if you've got 5 minutes to jump on YouTube and have a look at that, I'll pop that in the notes. The two Andrews, they were there. One of the Andrews had a brand new Amiga 1200, which I reckon he got from Ian Strickland over in the Perth Amiga user group. So he was pretty happy with his shiny new A1200. I don't think he knew what to do with it, but he had it there anyway. I had my Commodore 64 plumbed into one of those Commodore stereos as well, and somebody came up to me and said, "Oh, it's great, you've got the genuine speakers." And I was like, "Oh, wicked." I didn't actually realise I had the genuine speakers, because when I got it, somebody said to me, "I don't think these are the genuine speakers." So I was pretty chuffed. I had the White Lines demo running on that, so if you haven't seen that, that's worth a bit of a look to on the 64. Daniel and his lad had a couple of machines set up. There was some JVC speakers running on that. And then Daniel's lad was producing his own music on his Mac, so I think he stole Daniel's stereo at the end of the night.
Nice one.
But by far the best, it was a bit of a mixed bag because there was so much music going on, it wasn't funny.
I bet.
But by far the best, and this will probably get you excited, Tony, Nathan had a ZX81 with an extra board in the back of it that gave him extra memory, SD card, and some sound.
Right.
So he had the Monster Maze game running, I saw at one stage, and then I got over there and he had some chip tunes running on it. Wow. So if you're keen to look at that, it's on so it's on the I managed to get a small video. It's on Os Vintage Facebook page. Top effort by everyone that brought any audio equipment along. It was really well done. The next meet is on the 14th of July at Unley Community Centre from 5:30 p.m, and the theme is UK versus US versus aliens. I know that might sound a bit random, but that just got thrown in there at the last minute. So if you want a bit more information, just jump on the Facebook group. It's Adelaide Retro Computing Group. Or as I said, I quite often put the pictures up onto Retro Battle Stations subreddit. Get your gear out of the cupboard and get on down to Adelaide Retro.
These are my YouTube underdogs for the month. What I mean by an underdog is a channel that is fantastic and doing some wonderful retro content, but maybe isn't quite as popular or well known as some of the other big channels out there. But these are the channels which I reckon are worth watching because they're emerging, or they just do stuff a bit differently, but just floats my boat big style. The first underdog for this month is More Fun Making It. This is a British dude named Lee, mucking about with old computers in his shed. He does a lot of repairs, injects a lot of humour into it. He's got some pretty good production values, and he also just goes through the process of repairs. He joined YouTube back in 2011. He's had about 180,000 views on his channel, and he's currently sitting on about 3,500 subs, Craig.
Yeah, look, I jumped on it after you put it in the show notes, and I had watched his Commodore 128 video, and I was like, yep, subbed up straight away. I liked him. He's a funny dude.
Another British dude with a small channel, but I think he now identifies as Australian, is Chris, who you may know from This Week in Retro. He has his own channel called 005 Agema. I'm surprised at how few subs Chris has. He only has about 1,700 subs or so, which I find really odd, given that his style, it's more of a vlog style, and it started out as Chris trying to repurchase his childhood, all the consoles and computers he had and all the games, the big box games he had when he was growing up, and he's trying to buy this all back, but it's kind of now gone onto a bit of a different tangent with just games that he's enjoying and that sort of stuff. The videos only go for about 10 or 15 minutes each. They drop usually first thing on a Saturday morning, so they're a fun watch. He's over in Perth. Lovely bloke, and definitely well worth watching, Craig.
Yes, look, I've subbed to Chris for a couple of years, and I think he actually chooses to identify as a POM when he wants to identify as a POM, and identifies as an Aussie when he wants to identify as an Aussie.
So it's not just me that noticed that. I wonder if it's got anything to do with the Ashes or the rugby. I don't know. Sometimes he's Aussie, sometimes he's British, but as far as we're concerned, he's Chris, and we love what he does.
Part Amigian as well, I'd suggest.
Oh, yes, he's a big wheel down at the Perth Amiga Users Group Cracker Factory, I believe.
Yeah, no, he does a good job. He's promoting that, and he's got on the camera now down there at Perth Amiga User Group, and I see they've got their own channel as well. I'll drop that in the show notes as well.
Yeah, just going off topic for a minute, it would be cool if there was some sort of joint meet between ARC and Perth Amiga Users Group, but that'd obviously be very expensive and unfeasible.
On the Nullarbor?
Yeah, like at Euclid or something.
Meet halfway. YouTube Cream, this is like my bit of YouTube Cream that I sort of sometimes either come back to, is a little bit like Tony's Underdog, somebody who's a little bit underrated and I think needs to get out there. Generally, all their content is just well produced and I just keep coming back to it. So that's the cream that keeps rising to the top. My YouTuber is Bastich B for 64K. So he primarily focuses on Commodore 64 gaming content. Now, I think he's a bit of a retro love child because I think his mother might have been POW and his dad might have been NTSC because he grew up in South Africa and then he moved over to Canada. So it's a bit of a weird, probably a bit semi-Australian, got a bit of a weird mix of that PAL and NTSC. We ended up with machines from both continents.
Oh, right.
So the content that he puts together is just really well packaged, and he's so passionate and he's got such a wicked gaming room. You really need to see it. Like, I just go to Jealousy Factor 78 straight away and go, wow, look at all the shit that he's got. He does a general YouTube-y sort of stuff where he's got top 10s around shooters or top 10s around different genres. So that's pretty basic stuff. But he's got some pretty cool little random bits where he'll do judge versus jury, which is, he'll measure Speedball 1 and Speedball 2, or he might do Speedball on the Amiga versus Speedball on the C64. So he's got some sort of oddball little bits out there. He does the unconverted, so some games that have come out in the arcade but never really made it to the 64. So one of the favourite things that he does is a publisher series, and he'll go through like Psygnosis, Activision, Epix, or someone like System 3 on the 64, and he'll do a complete bio history, how they got started. And I think it's really interesting. Sometimes you see some of these developers actually started, they wrote a couple of games, and then they formed a company and they never wrote another game again. So some of those guys from Epix and that, it's really unique. And then he'll run through every game in chronological order. You get to see who the developers, the pixel artists and the musicians, and there's quite a few crossovers, especially like if you look at Epix with summer games and winter games, California games, all those sort of things. It's really great the way they meld together, or even System 3, something will pop out and you go, oh, wow, I didn't know that they released that. Another one that I really enjoy is a retro road trip, a bit like LGR with his thrifting. So he heads out and he usually times it in with a game show, sometimes like in Calgary for a retro game event, and he'll cruise along and he'll pick up some videos and some games. He always does a retro game shop or two on the way, and it's sort of, when you start watching these people, you go, oh, he's back to the same shop or he's back to the same Goodwill, and I find that quite interesting. And then you get a bit of a wrap-up of the actual show itself, so I quite find that pretty cool. The creme de la creme, as we like to say in the YouTube cream world, is his arcade series. So he's done this arcade series that's a 3-parter that goes pretty much nearly for 10 and a half hours when you break it down. So the first section is that pre-1980 stuff where he goes through all the mechanical devices that were out there, the pinball machines and the throw whack-a-mole and all that sort of stuff. Then he slowly moves into the Tube era, so Pong, bloody racing car games, Space Invaders, because that was pretty much just released just before the 80s, and I remember seeing my first Space Invaders machine. Yeah, so that's his wrap-up of the 70s, or basically up until the 1980s, and that's where he really cracks into it. Once he gets into the 1980s, the production and the cinematography that he brings to the table is really cool. He runs through every year. He'll run through a whole bunch of genres or different companies like Capcom and Bandco. It's really well put together. I really love it, and it really tugs on the old heartstrings. You go through all the different versions of Galaga and all the clones that come out, and then the Moon Patrol, and you're into Rally X, and then Pac-Man and all these other things. I really love it, and he sort of ties it in with the theme for that year, so it might have a bit of an A-Team or the Goonies. And look, it's just as a bit of a final shout-out, he does actually have a podcast as well called Hands On Gaming that he does with a guy in Melbourne called Darren. I've never met Darren, haven't spoken to Darren, but Darren's always talks about Dodgy Dave, who used to get his pirated software from, and I quite relate to that. I think that's quite funny. Their podcast focuses around reviewing a game across every single platform that it was released on. So California games, they'll go through the Amstrad, the Atari, the Amiga version, if it came out on the Super NES, and they pretty much give it a bit of a critique. But they've changed their format a little bit. They actually just sort of sit around and talk about gaming and talk about shit at the moment. So they've only just moved to that format. It's a bit like this format, Tony. So, yeah, that's my bit of cream. That's Reason to the Top. So, yeah, very well put together and, yeah, very, very well done. So get onto the old Bastich B for 64K. I'll put a link in the show notes.
One of our big plans with Grumpy Oz Retro is to talk with people about vintage computing and or retro gaming. We're keen to capture as many stories as possible, so if you have any guest suggestions or if you want to tell your story, hit us up at grumpyozretro.com. Our very first guest is someone who is well known in the vintage community, not just in Australia, but around the world. Not only does he have his own YouTube channel, but he's appeared on This Week in Retro and occasionally pops up on other channels as well. You might know him as Mr. Lurch, but I know him as Jace. We kicked off our chat by reflecting on a recent milestone. Jace, congrats on the 10,000 subscriber mark. How are you feeling about all that?
Thank you very much. It's a milestone. Look, it's at the end of the day, I'm still reasonably a fairly small channel. I think it's one of those milestones that a lot of us smaller channels just kind of look forward to because 100,000 is just so far away. Your brain just can't even kind of comprehend that, like, that many subscribers listening to me. What the hell? But 10,000 is like when you start building at least a bit of an audience, it starts to become kind of like 10,000 becomes a conceivable number that you might actually reach.
Yeah.
So that the channel turned 5 back in February.
Yep.
And I was at about 8,500 at that point, and admittedly a little disappointed that I didn't hit 10 for the channel's 5th birthday.
Oh, yeah.
And then it just kind of sat at the low 9,000s for like 6 months nearly. And it was that ZX81 video that suddenly took off for no apparent reason. And next thing you knew, I had 10,000 subscribers and it ticked over right in the middle of a like Teams meeting at work.
Guess you would have got some sort of notification as soon as the 10,000 came through, and I'm sure it would have made your meeting a bit more interesting.
Well, it did, because I actually started the meeting kind of going, look, if I'm a little distracted, I've got like my YouTube studio page open here and I'm going refresh. And they're like, oh, no, that's fine.
Obviously, the people you work with are aware that you do the YouTube thing.
Yep.
What's their reaction been to that?
Okay, so some of them just think it's cool. They're like, that's really cool. What's the link? I'll subscribe, that kind of thing. And other people, they'll ask questions, what's it about, yada, yada, yada. And I tell them, it's all about vintage computers and all that kind of stuff. You've seen the ones in the hallway over in Building 3. Yeah, they're all mine. And, the conversation goes on and that's all fine. Then you do get the few that kind of just laugh, they just don't really know what to say or how to take it. it's like, oh yeah, didn't you know I had a third head? And it's kind of, and they're like,
I guess it is one of those things where if you're not into this sort of scene, it probably is a bit difficult to comprehend. So I totally get why some people might think it's a little bit different, I guess you could say.
Yeah, but the people at work were all legitimately happy for me and excited for me when I hit 10,000, and, and the dean of the faculty was just kind of like, yeah, that's awesome, and all that kind of stuff. So it was good.
Was it the 5th anniversary where you actually showed one of your lectures that you gave to the first year students that was like during O Week or something like that, just explaining why old computers are cool and why it's so important to bear them in mind when they're embarking on their studies in computer science these days?
For those that don't know, I work at the University of Canberra. I'm not an academic, but so one of our first semester courses is Introduction to Information Technology. Basically now as a standard guest lecture on the very first lecture, I get up and I do this lecture on the history of the home computer. It's a very concise, very kind of shortened version. I can't, obviously in 40 minutes or whatever, I can't go into every single detail. And I do it twice a year. And it's actually been really difficult over the last couple of years because you go into the lecture theatre and everyone's been wearing a mask.
Mm.
And it's impossible when you're up at the front of, because at the end of the day, it's essentially a performance. And it's really difficult to know basically how you're doing or that immediate kind of feedback you get from an audience when everyone's wearing a mask.
True.
But that one that was last recorded at the beginning of this year, it went really, really well. And look, put it this way. The average university lecture doesn't get a round of applause at the end of it. This one did. I got a proper round of applause from the 300 of students that were in the lecture theatre, and they all came down the front and wanted to take photos and have a chat and have a play. And when I do it, I've got at least a couple of trolleys worth of computers on display so I can, hold things up and go, hey, this is an Apple II or whatever it was. But none of them are running because it's just, it's the front of a lecture theatre. Without a doubt, the last one I did was the best response I got from ever doing one of those lectures.
Oh, that's fantastic. In case the listeners not aware of the Mr. Lurch origin story, could you give us a bit of a rundown as to what got you into the whole computery thing and how you ended up where you are today?
So my parents were right into computing. And so we're talking kind of, late 70s, early 80s at this point. My mother was actually a programmer, even way back then. She was a COBOL programmer.
Oh, wow.
And my father was always right into computers as well. His main thing, he was a draftsman by trade. So he was actually really interested in computers from a CAD point of view. And we always had I think I've said this in the past, but our family's first computer was a Dick Smith System 80. And then we went System 80. I think we had a TRS-80 Model 3 and then a Model 4 and then into PCs.
Oh, yeah.
So there was always a computer in the house since I was 3 or 4 years old. It was strange that I played console games and computer games and all the rest of it, but I was never really into computers through my teenage years. And as an example, I didn't actually even do computer science at high school.
Oh, right.
And I ended up kind of falling into the industry by getting a part-time job at just a local computer store, and I was just a break and fix computer technician, nothing exciting.
Okay.
And then just kind of worked up the food chain from there, and now I'm an IT manager at a university with a master's degree. But going back, I have a bad habit of basically being heavily involved in a hobby, and then I'll just kind of get bored of it and I'll jump ship. So for a long time, for about a good 10 years, I was heavily involved in motorcycling in the local community.
I can tell by looking at the shed, I do see a bit of motorcycling paraphernalia, and we should probably talk about that at some stage, but not today.
Yep. Yeah, there is still a few things kicking around the shed. My old Kawasaki is still there, and I'll get it back on the road one day, I promise. But things kind of happen like they do in communities and all the rest of it, and I had enough of it. And it was about that time that I started watching a lot more we'll just call it retro computer YouTubing. When we're talking the usual, we're talking Neil and LGR and 8-Bit Guy, people like that. And it was about that same time I happened to be out at the Green Shed. And if people don't know, here in Canberra, at both the tips, there is the Green Shed, which is like the recycling kind of centre, that they sell things. And I walked in there and there was a fairly mint VIC-20 power supply, a couple of cartridges, that kind of thing. And it was like dirt. We're talking like $20.
How many years ago was that, Jace?
So it was about 6 or 7 years ago. So it was just before before things went, batshit crazy like they are now.
Yeah.
And so, I took it home and I made up a video cable because that was missing. And, by Googling on the internet and, I kind of went, oh, look, here's a thing. And then I started picking up just the occasional machine. But then what happened was it was about that time where at work, because we'd already been doing things with Raspberry Pis, but we started getting more and more and more into it. Like, so we, on average, well, apart from the last couple of years, we haven't been able to buy them, but at the beginning of every year, I'll go buy 50 Raspberry Pis basically just to restock our teaching labs.
Cool.
And I'd heard about this bare metal Commodore 64 emulator, but also another one, but it wasn't bare metal. It was a Combian, I think the name of it was. And it was essentially a pre-wrapped Raspberry Pi distro with Vice kind of built into it and all the rest of it. And I managed to pick up from somewhere an empty Commodore 64 case with a keyboard. I went and bought a Kira and I plugged this Raspberry Pi into it. And it was kind of, no one had actually really done it on YouTube before. And so I kind of built this thing and I went, I wonder if I should film a video. And so I kind of grabbed my camera, and I knew nothing about shooting video. Like I'd done a lot of photography, but shooting video is completely different, especially when I worry about, light and sound and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And so I grabbed my camera, I stuck it on a tripod, I pointed it over my shoulder, and I basically just started talking at the camera, kind of going, oh, and I did this and I did that and yada, yada, yada. And here's how's it work. And that actually ended up being my first video I uploaded to YouTube. And up until recently, it was still actually my most viewed video. I'd have to go look at my studio page, but it's still up there in the top, 3 or 4 videos from my channel is this horribly, horribly shot video about sticking a Raspberry Pi into a Commodore 64 case. And it just kind of built from there. Like I did that and I then did a follow-up video on that. And then I picked something else up and it just kind of grew. But the biggest thing, and you'll probably know this as well, is that it's not just about, producing the content and building an audience that way. It's also about getting to know fellow YouTubers.
Absolutely.
Because they're all more than happy to help out.
Oh, yeah. And this is a great thing with doing what we do in the community is that you get out of it what you put into it. And it's just not necessarily those who are making content as such. It's just people in the community in general, like on Twitter, Mastodon, on forums, in Facebook groups. And I know that the Australian Vintage Computer Collectors Facebook group is your baby. How are you enjoying that at the moment?
It potters along. It does its thing. 99.9% of people are well behaved, like any Facebook group. Most people don't break the rules kind of deliberately. It's more like on the buy, sell, swap group. They're not like viciously out to break the rules. It's just like with any buy, sell, swap, people jump on Marketplace and then just tick all the, where else do you want to post this? And they tick all the boxes.
Yeah.
And then I have to go through and go, no, that's not vintage. No, that's not even a computer. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
But no, for the most part, it just kind of takes care of itself. And I've got a bunch of really good co-admins. So people like, Australia's TRS-80 God, Ian, he's one of the admins, and Ingmar and Randall and Anthony and all those kind of people. And, like I said, it's just going to take care of itself. It's reasonably active. I think the activity of most Facebook groups over the last 12 months is taking a bit of a nosedive now that people have kind of gotten back into the real world. But no, we're happy. It kind of does its thing. Yeah, it's not bad.
The 2023 Canberra Vintage Computer Expo, from what I could tell, it was absolutely massive, Jace. Was it as amazing as it looked to those of us watching from afar?
We were really happy with it. Okay, so there's a little bit of backstory. About 6 or 8 months previous, we'd run a tiny little show just as a bit of a litmus test because we had no idea if anyone would show up. Tiny little hall right at the bottom end of Canberra, and the place was packed. So we're like, okay, if we're going to do this again, let's find somewhere bigger. And we managed to get hold of a fairly large school hall with all the tables and everything that came with it. So we put it on. All the organisers had been absolutely flat knacker for the first half of this, the first chunk of this year. And so we'd done, bugger all marketing. It was only like 3 days before I managed to get on the radio to give it a bit of a plug, things like that. But yeah, it was good. We had we have no idea how many people because we weren't really counting. And by the end of it, we were all absolutely knackered. Oh. But I do look back on the footage and the photos and all the rest of it and kind of go, yeah, that was pretty good. Because at the time, you're not really thinking about it. You just kind of go, 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 go. But once everything was wrapped up and everyone had a chance to relax and look back on it, yeah, we're really happy with it.
Everyone involved should be really proud of what they've achieved. And I realise it's probably a little early to ask the question, but how's the planning for 2024 going?
Not started. I think we're all just kind of like, because the other thing is you start really kind of going, wow, that was a lot of work. I mean, as an example, I had 20 machines just of my own there, right? So, you've got 2 weeks at least leading up to it of pulling everything down, testing it, making sure you've got all the cables for every computer, because I have a bad habit of like sharing cables, like, SCART cables and things like that across multiple machines. This big 2-week lead up, but then it was like 4 carloads worth of vintage computers there and then pack up as well. And it was exhausting. It really, really was. And I have promised I'm not taking that many machines to a show again. That nearly killed me. More people can chip in next time. No, it was great. We had a bunch of guys from Melbourne. So Ian, David, and Alan, and someone else all came up from Melbourne. We had a bunch of people come down from Sydney, like Riley, with all his various, like about 2/3 of the Australia table, which we made sure we put front and center at the show, was all brought down by Riley from Sydney. So, yeah, it was a big effort, not just me and the local organisers, but by a lot of other people as well.
Yeah, there's rumblings from Adelaide that there might be a few Adelaideans wanting to come and join the party in 2024. So we were going to ask what we could do to help, but it sounds like you may have dropped the hint to say, look, if someone could just bring some shit over from elsewhere so I don't have to schlep everything over myself, would that be a good place to begin?
That would be a good start. One thing that really did help is I basically spun up just a sheet on Google Drives and broke it up into categories. And basically said to anyone, look, if you're bringing something, please just put it on the list. That kind of helped because at least in the few days leading up to it, we knew what was coming. We knew the Australian table was going to be great. We knew we probably had too many Commodores, things like that. The British table actually ended up being really popular. That was kind of cool. So I had my Beeb and Elk there and my CPC 464 with its monitor, with all its monitor and all the rest of it. And then David bought up heaps of stuff. So he had his ZX80, 81, various Spectrums. I don't think he bought his QL, but Carl had his telecomputer there, which obviously you're a fan of.
Yes, the computer phone, yes. I saw that.
The computer phone.
That was pretty cool. That was one of my highlights. Yeah. That and the Dulmont Magnum on the Australian table, because I'd heard so much about it, but I'd never actually seen one out in the wild.
Alan Lawton bought that up. And for those listening that don't really know, Alan is kind of almost like Australia's archivist. He basically spends his days scanning and archiving anything Australian computer related that he can get his hands on. Yeah, he brought that along, and that was really cool to see. It's such a funky looking computer with this kind of rotating pop-up screen in the middle of it, and yeah, it's very cool.
Now, this is a question that Craig had, and this is in the back of my mind as well, and I realise it might be really hard to answer, but I was getting a bit of a vibe that if this keeps going like it is in Canberra, because of its location and because of the enthusiasm for it, possibility of maybe turning into Australia's own VCF. What are the odds?
That was actually even mentioned on the day. I don't think we'll kind of hit them up, like maybe for the next one. Let's get a couple under our sleeves first. But
definitely.
Yeah, I think there's definitely, especially, being it held in Australia's capital, if you're going to do it, it is the place to do it. And if we do that, it'll be a 2-day event. So we'll do it a bit like what VC Fed does, in the sense that there's like seminars or whatever on one day, and then the big open hall show thing on the second day. So yeah, little kind of tentative ideas at this stage, but it definitely has promise. There's no doubt about it.
I know a lot of people our age kind of got into the online space, obviously with BBSs and news groups and that sort of stuff. Did you find yourself online before being online was a thing?
I really didn't. I've got to be honest. When I was a kid, so we're talking kind of early teens, I think, we had our 486 by that stage. So, and my father had picked up a secondhand modem, because I don't know if you remember, like back in the early 90s, modems were freaking expensive.
Oh God, yes. I bought myself a Netcom E5 9600, like V32. Yep. I felt like the Pope of Chili Town. I got it on a SysOp discount because I had a part-time BBS, mainly so I could get the modem on a SysOp discount, and that was like $500, but full retail was like $1,000. And I thought I was king shit when I had that modem. So I totally get it. They were not cheap in the pre-internet days. Yeah.
No, and long distance phone calls were stupidly expensive as well.
Yeah.
Anyway, so my father managed to pick up this modem. I can't even remember. Don't even ask me what speed it was, but it was probably like, 9600 or whatever, something like that. And for the life of us, we could not get this thing to work. And, the guy my father got it from said it was working and all the rest of it. And it actually got to the point where one of the technicians from our local ISP actually came round and to set it up for us. And he's just like, I can't get this thing to work. And then we just kind of forgot about it for a while. And I then didn't really get online until, at a guess, kind of 96, 97 or something like that. And by that time you were on the internet. BBSs had kind of already been replaced, I suppose. And still to this day, I still never can get my head around how use groups works. I just can't. Sorry. I don't know what to do, because it's just a thing that kind of happened before me. The closest I get these days is I've got a couple of modern Wi-Fi modems for some of my vintage machines. Keith runs a BBS, the link to which will be in the show notes. And so he's kind of like, whenever I'm trying to test something, I'll usually try and test it by trying to connect to his BBS.
Cool. Better late than never. Over the journey, not just the last 5 years, but even when you're not making videos, you've clearly done a whole bunch of repairs and restos and that sort of situation with all your vintage gear. What was the most memorable machine that you worked with? Was there anything that really fought you all the way, or you felt like extra buzzed that you got it to work? Anything stand out in particular?
I've got an Apple II Euro Plus, which just fought me every single step of the way. Now, I don't know if you know those early Apples, but essentially, like it was great. All the chips are socketed. The problem is all the sockets are made of cheese. Like my hardcore in-depth knowledge of like 74 series logic is not great. It just, it fought me every single step of the way. I eventually did get it running. It can still be temperamental, but then again, if you actually take a look at a lot of those really early machines, so we're talking like TRS-80 Model 1, the Commodore PET, things like that, they're all actually really temperamental. Even if you ask Ian, I mentioned a minute ago, our TRS-80 God, even his immaculate TRS-80 Model 1, it might power on when he turns it on. Luckily, though, with those machines, at least, it's usually just some of the chips have decided to work their way out or something like that, push down on the Z80 and, hey, look, up it comes. Of the ones that really fought me all the way, it was definitely the Apple II Euro Plus.
I think I remember the video series for that, and it certainly seemed like you weren't having a great time with that one.
It really wasn't. But there has been a few kind of like hurrah moments where I legitimately didn't think something was going to power up, and all of a sudden it did. Macs are always good for that, because basically anything post Mac Plus essentially you just recap it, right?
Yeah.
Because they all, from the SE onwards, they've all got leaky caps. Whenever you do a full recap on a board, unless you're someone like brilliant, like Bruce or someone like that.
Oh, yeah.
There is always that moment of you hit the power and you just hope. Actually, the biggest one for that was when I recapped my Amiga 600.
Oh, yeah.
And the reason is because if you don't have a hard drive or a floppy drive plugged into an Amiga 600, the kickstart actually sits there with a black screen looking for an IDE device or a floppy drive for ages with a black screen.
All right.
So you power it on and you get the monitor goes, hey, there's a signal and it's just a black screen.
Yeah.
And you go, oh no, I've killed it. All I'm getting is a black screen. And it's like a minute. It'll sit there for like a minute if you don't have anything plugged into it. And you're just kind of going, oh God, it's dead. It's dead. And then all of a sudden out of nowhere, like the kickstart screen comes up and you just go, yay!
Being collectors, they're obviously machines that we've all coveted for a very long time. And, we eventually get them and it's sort of, I don't know how to describe it. My notes say that, it was like when Wile E. Coyote caught the Roadrunner and didn't know what to do with him, so he let him go. Have you had any machines that you kind of have coveted and you finally caught and then you're like, oh?
I haven't actually done the video on this one yet, but I recently picked up a Dick Smith Cat. Ah. So for those that don't know, the Dick Smith Cat was a very short-lived Dick Smith Imports, also known as the Laser 3000, that was kind of sort of maybe Apple II compatible. And the problem is that on its own, it's not very Apple II compatible at all. The accessories, they just don't exist anymore. And so I was so excited to get this computer, and then essentially reality caught up with me and realized that, yeah, it's a great looking computer. It's wonderful to have and all the rest of it. But to use, it's not that great because you've got to have these accessories that don't exist anymore. And yeah, it's still there. It's still on the list to get fixed and be shown on the channel. But I think it will be it'll be a catch and release once the video is done.
And that leads me nicely to another question. I know that in this particular hobby, some people tend to be more of like they want all the things, the idea of catch and release, like they kind of can't get their head wrapped around.
They're called hoarders, Tony. You can call them that. They're hoarders. Right?
I wasn't sure if that was going to be, I guess, politically incorrect or something like that. I guess what I'm getting at here is, I think you may have already hinted at this, Jace, but in terms of your own approach to this particular hobby, do you feel comfortable with the catch and release, or do you prefer to keep all the things?
It really depends on the machine. I have actually been doing more selling over the last 6 or 12 months, purely for the fact that there's a huge financial investment in these machines, especially with prices going ridiculous the way they have over the last couple of years.
Oh, absolutely.
And so it's either been for reasons of space or reasons of having just duplication within the collection. Like at one point I had 4 different Atari 8-bit computers. Now I absolutely love the Atari 8-bit line. I think it's one of the most underrated computer lines from the early 80s. But it occurred to me that I just didn't need that many, right, of that all basically did the same thing. Same with my Tandy things. Like I had both a Model 3 and a Model 4. Now they look fantastic sitting next to each other, but do I really need both? And with things being so expensive as they are these days, it basically then also reached the financial point of like, okay, if I want this other computer, in order to basically justify the costs, I'm going to need to sell 1 or 2 things in order to buy it. And I have been doing that more and more. As an example, that's essentially what funded my PET. It also funded my Amiga 1000.
Oh, yeah.
And the other thing that I have been doing is, like with any collector, right? When you first get into it, you just buy everything.
Yeah, true.
Right?
True.
You jump on eBay and you just go select all buy now. But what I've been really, really trying to do is actually concentrating on getting my hands on the machines that I really, really want. And so I have now, because of that, managed to pick up some of my Grail machines, so like the PET and the Amiga 1000 and things like that. In saying that, over the last few months, I've ended up with a ridiculous number of Macs because they were I picked them up for free. So,
wow.
Well, they're free. You can't say no.
Oh, exactly. Exactly.
So I've been on this weird kind of Apple trip lately. So we're talking, the earliest one I think I picked up was a 2CI, and I love the 2CI. I think it's a great computer, all the way through to kind of like the G3, G4 kind of era. And that's where my interest kind of peters out a bit. I do actually really like the G3 and the G4 era as well. I just think there's some really cool computers in there.
Oh, definitely. I totally get selling machines off. You want to try and fund the next purchase and basically trade up to what you really want. As far as the most wanted list, the machine that you're really chasing, the grail that you're after at the moment, which machine is at the top of that list right now?
That's a really hard question because for a long, long time it was an Atari 800 and I finally got one a few months ago.
Yeah.
There isn't anything really. Okay, no, that's actually not true because I'm on this big Apple hit at the moment. I would love to get my hands on one of those, like the really, really high-end tower 90s Macs. So we're talking like the Quadra 9000 or just one of those big behemoth Macs. No idea why, but it's something I am legitimately looking for at the moment. Not that I'm a huge Apple person, but yeah, right now that's the itch that needs scratching.
That's totally understandable. And just one final question. The podcast is called Grumpy Oz Retro, and it was kind of jokingly with Craig and I, although we do occasionally get stuff off our chest that grinds our gears about the hobby. This is a safe space. Is there anything about this hobby that pisses you off?
There is, actually. And it's the attitude of some small communities within the larger community that seem to kind of take this sense of ownership over something, like over a particular computer. So as an example, as a YouTuber, if I do a video on a particular computer, it's not unheard of for some member of that community to then jump in the comments and go, oh, you should have reached out to, the community because the community knows all and yada, 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 and all this kind of stuff. And I'm just like, oh, piss off. None of my videos go into that much detail. It's not my style of video. And believe it or not, I know how to Google too. So just, this sense of ownership, like almost like, you need permission from this small segment of the community in order to even like talk about that particular computer. That's one of the things that really grinds my gears.
I think that's a great place to leave this. Thank you so much for your time, Jace. Much appreciated. Is there anything you want to plug before we finish up?
Obviously check out the channel. That would be nice. Subscribe. See if we can get, to that 100,000. No, I'm kidding. It's never going to happen. But no, that's pretty much about it. I'm looking forward to seeing where this podcast goes, and I hope you get some great guests on.
Well, we've had a fantastic start, Jace. So look, thank you again for your time, mate. Much appreciated.
No problem. Thanks, mate.
A huge thanks again to Jace for his time, and thank you for listening to Grumpy Oz Retro. Head over to grumpyozretro.com to get in touch with us, as well as to get your show notes and details of where you can catch the pod. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and the Oz Retro Comp YouTube channel, or you can go grab an RSS feed link from the website and put it in your favourite pod app, just in case we're not showing up there yet.
Awesome.
In the meantime, check out the links in the show notes, and we'll see you again in a few weeks.
Thanks everyone for listening, and don't forget, stay retro.